Story number 1. The detention room. Maplewood Middle School's room 217 wasn't on any of the official schedules. It wasn't used for classes, assemblies, or storage. Instead, it served one purpose: detention. The room had no windows, just rows of old wooden desks with deep scratches carved into them. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, and the air always felt stale, no matter how many students sat inside. There was a rumor among the students that room 217 wasn't just for detention, it was for punishment. But not from the teachers, from something else. Jenna had never been in trouble before. She was the kind of kid who turned in her homework early and said thank you to the cafeteria staff. But when her math teacher caught her passing a note in class, one she hadn't even written, she was sentenced to 2 hours in room 217 after school. It's just a room, Jenna told herself as she walked down the silent hall. The echoes of her footsteps felt louder with every step. She stopped outside the heavy door, 217. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open. The room was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting strange shadows on the walls. Jenna noticed the desks were older than she expected, their surfaces worn and scarred with years of graffiti. She sat down at the desk closest to the door, gripping her pencil tightly. She wasn't alone. 3 other students were scattered across the room, their heads down. Mrs. Fields, the stern detention monitor, sat at the teacher's desk, a thick novel in her hands. "Sit quietly," she said, without looking up. "And don't leave your seat." Jenna nodded, though the rules seemed unnecessary. Who would want to wander in a place like this? At first, everything was fine. Jenna doodled in her notebook, trying to ignore the faint hum of the lights. But then she noticed something odd. The girl in the desk across the room, a quiet 7th grader named Grace, was staring at the wall. Her mouth moved silently, like she was talking to someone, but no one was there. "Grace?" Jenna whispered. Grace didn't respond. She just kept mouthing words Jenna couldn't hear. Mrs. Fields didn't seem to notice. The clock ticked on. Jenna glanced at the boy behind her, Evan, a troublemaker known for skipping class. He was slumped over his desk, his hoodie pulled over his head, but something about the way he was sitting looked off. "Evan?" Jenna whispered, leaning slightly closer. He didn't move. Her heart pounded as she realized his hoodie wasn't just over his head, it was pulled tight around his face, as if something inside was pressing against the fabric. "Stop staring," Mrs. Fields said sharply, her voice cutting through the silence. Jenna snapped back to her seat, but she couldn't stop glancing at Evan. The hoodie seemed to shift, bulging outward as if something inside was trying to get out. The door creaked open and Jenna jumped. A boy she didn't recognize shuffled inside. His clothes were wrinkled and torn, his hair matted. He moved awkwardly, as though his limbs didn't quite work the way they should. "You're late," Mrs. Fields said without looking up. The boy didn't respond. He took the desk nearest the back of the room and sat down, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Jenna's skin crawled. She didn't remember seeing him at school before. The room grew colder. Jenna rubbed her arms, trying to shake the chill. She glanced at the clock and frowned. The hands hadn't moved since she'd arrived. Her pencil rolled off her desk, clattering to the floor. As she leaned down to pick it up, she froze. Beneath the desk, carved deep into the wood, were the words, "Don't look at them." Jenna sat up quickly, her breathing uneven. "Don't look at who?" she muttered under her breath. The answer came sooner than she wanted. The lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging the room into darkness before buzzing back to life. When the light returned, the room was no longer the same. The desks were rearranged, twisted at odd angles, their surfaces covered in fresh scratches. Grace was gone. So was Evan. The boy in the back corner sat motionless, his head now twisted completely backward, his gray, hollow eyes fixed on Jenna. She screamed, jumping from her seat. "Sit down," Mrs. Fields barked. But Jenna stammered, pointing toward the boy. "He doesn't belong to you," Mrs. Fields said coldly, finally looking up from her book. Jenna backed toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to close in around her, the air growing heavier. The scratching sound started then, louder and more frantic, as if something was clawing at the walls. She turned to Mrs. Fields, desperate. "Please, let me out." Mrs. Fields sighed, standing up slowly. "Detention isn't over yet, Jenna." Her voice was wrong, deeper, distorted, as if layered with other voices. Jenna's eyes darted around the room. The shadows in the corners began to move, taking shape. Thin, spindly figures emerged, their limbs impossibly long, their faces featureless except for mouths stretched wide in silent screams. "Sit down." They whispered in unison, their voices echoing in Jenna's head. She bolted for the door, slamming her fists against it. The figures moved closer, their fingers curling like claws. And then the lights went out. The next morning, room 217 was empty. Mrs. Field sat at her desk as if nothing had happened. "Who's in detention today?" the principal asked, poking his head in. "No one," she replied, a faint smile on her lips. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the scratching inside room 217. And sometimes, if you stand outside the door, you'll hear a voice. Software desperate. Let me out. Story number 2. The basement bell, Chestnut Hills Academy, was old, so old that parts of it were falling apart. The basement in particular was strictly off limits. Students claimed to hear strange noises from below, faint whispers, echoing footsteps, and the distant chime of a bell. Teachers dismissed the rumors, saying the basement was just used for storage, but no one could explain why the heavy door at the bottom of the stairwell was always locked with multiple chains. And no one could explain why the bells sometimes rang, even when there was no one down there. Ellie didn't believe in ghost stories. She was a skeptic, a straight-A student with no patience for superstition. But when she accidentally spilled paint on her class's art project, one that was due the next morning, she needed a solution fast. "Ms. Taylor keeps the spare supplies in the basement," whispered Sam, her best friend. Ellie hesitated. "I thought the basement was locked." Sam smirked. "The janitor always leaves the key in the supply closet. No big deal." Ellie glanced at the clock. Everyone had gone home, except for a few teachers. If she was quick, no one would even notice. The basement stairs creaked under her weight as Ellie descended into the dimly lit hallway. The air grew colder with every step, the faint smell of mildew and rust filling her nose. She reached the bottom and stared at the door. It was a heavy, rusted thing with peeling paint and chains hanging loosely across it. A single keyhole gleamed in the dim light. Ellie inserted the key and turned it. With a loud click, the chains fell away. Inside, the basement was cavernous, with rows of old furniture, broken desks, and forgotten boxes stacked haphazardly. Ellie used her phone's flashlight to navigate, her steps echoing loudly. "Paint, paint," she muttered, scanning the shelves. Her light caught something strange, an old brass handbell sitting on a wooden table. It looked out of place, far too pristine for such a dusty, forgotten room. She stepped closer, the hair on her arms rising. The bell was engraved with swirling patterns, and when she reached out to touch it, the metal felt unnaturally cold. Her breath caught as she noticed something else, faint footprints in the dust leading to the bell. But there were no footprints leaving. The sound of movement startled her. It wasn't loud, just a soft scuff of a shoe against the floor coming from deeper in the basement. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. No response. The light from her phone flickered, and for a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the shadows. But when the light steadied, it was gone. She shook her head, forcing a laugh. "Get a grip, Ellie." Grabbing a box of paint from the shelf, she turned to leave. And that's when the bell rang. It wasn't a loud ring, just a single soft chime that echoed unnaturally in the silent basement. Ellie froze, the box slipping from her hands. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. No answer. The shadows seemed to press closer, the air growing colder. Her flashlight flickered again, and she realized with a jolt that the bell was now in the center of the room, even though she hadn't touched it. Then it rang again. This time, the sound was louder, reverberating through her chest. She bolted for the door, her heart pounding, but the door wouldn't budge. The chains that had fallen away were now back in place, wrapped tightly around the handle. "Help!" she screamed, banging on the metal. Behind her, the bell rang a third time. Her phone light flickered out completely, plunging the room into darkness. She heard footsteps then, soft and deliberate, coming closer. "Who's there?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. A voice answered low and gravelly, as though it hadn't been used in years. "You rang the bell." The lights flickered on for a brief moment, and Ellie wished they hadn't. The figure standing before her was tall and gaunt, its face a horrifying mask of stretched, pale skin with empty black pits where its eyes should have been. In its long, bony fingers, it held the bell. "You called me!" it rasped, raising the bell high. Ellie screamed as the creature swung it downward, the sound ripping through her like a physical force. And then there was nothing but silence. The next day, the janitor found the basement door wide open. The bell was back on the table, shining as if freshly polished. There was no sign of Ellie, only a single footprint in the dust leading to the bell, and none leading away. Story number 3. The classroom. That time forgot. The rumors about room 404 had been circulating for decades. It was an unused classroom at the far end of the 3rd floor in Greystone High. Unlike the rest of the school, with its bustling students and modern touches, room 404 looked untouched since the 1950s. Dusty desks were neatly arranged in rows. Faded posters clung to the walls, and a chalkboard filled with half-erased writing sat at the front of the room. Teachers claimed it was used for storage, but students knew better. They said room 404 was cursed. No one remembered who first dared Tommy Parker to go inside. Tommy wasn't one to back down, especially not in front of his friends. "I'll do it," he said, grinning. "It's just an old classroom. What's the worst that can happen?" The group met after school, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls as they approached the forbidden door. Tommy turned the knob. It was unlocked. "See? Easy." He pushed it open, stepping inside as his friends hung back. The air was thick and stale, carrying the scent of chalk dust and mildew. It was colder too, much colder than the rest of the school. Tommy smirked and waved his flashlight around. Creepy, but not scary. But then the door slammed shut behind him. Outside, his friends shouted and pounded on the door. "Tommy, open it!" "I didn't close it," he yelled back, rattling the knob. "It's stuck." Suddenly, the pounding from outside stopped. "Guys," Tommy called. Silence. He pressed his ear to the door, his heart racing. He could still hear the faint murmur of their voices, but they sounded far away, as though muffled by layers of concrete. Turning back to the room, Tommy noticed something strange. The desks were no longer covered in dust. They looked polished, almost new, and the faint smell of cleaning supplies replaced the musty air. A breeze brushed past him, though there were no open windows. He froze as he heard it. Faint laughter. Turning slowly, he saw them. Students, dozens of them sitting in the desks, their faces turned toward the front of the room. They wore outdated clothes, boys in pressed slacks and girls in knee-length skirts, their hair perfectly styled. None of them looked at him. At the front of the class, a man stood, writing on the chalkboard. He was tall and thin, his back to Tommy. Hello?" Tommy said, his voice cracking. The teacher turned slowly, his face pale and hollow, his sunken eyes locking onto Tommy with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "You're late," the man said, his voice low and cold. I think I have the wrong room," Tommy stammered, stepping back toward the door. But the students turned then, their heads snapping toward him in perfect unison. Their eyes were empty. "You're late," they said, their voices blending into a chilling chorus. Tommy lunged for the door, yanking the knob with all his strength. It wouldn't budge. Behind him, the teacher's footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate. "You can't leave," the man said, his voice growing louder, deeper. "Class is in session." Tommy spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The students were standing now, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They began to chant, their voices growing louder with every word. "Stay, learn, forever." The teacher raised his hand, and suddenly the room began to spin. The walls twisted and warped, the desks melting into shadowy shapes. Tommy screamed as the students moved closer, their hands reaching out cold and skeletal. The next morning, Tommy's friends reported his disappearance to the principal. "He went into room 404, one of them said, trembling. "We saw him go in, but he never came out." The principal frowned. "Room 404? That's impossible. That classroom's been locked for years." But the principal led them to the 3rd floor, where the door to room 404 stood closed. He tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. "See, locked. Now stop spreading nonsense and get to class." As the students walked away, one of them glanced back. Through the narrow glass window on the door, they thought they saw something. A face pressed against the glass, pale and terrified. It looked like Tommy, and then it was gone.